We begin with World Watchers, and this is KAZU FM in Pacific Grove, California. It's Mae Brussell, and it's broadcast number 611, August 22nd, 1983. There were so many important news stories in the newspaper this past week that it would be impossible to cover them all. And my first frustration is try to run them down quickly and hit as many bases as I can, or I can go slowly and get caught up. But very many times people wonder why I'm on a particular subject that doesn't seem connected to what I said 2 weeks ago or a year ago. And then later the news catches up and they understand that, thankfully, gratefully. And this week I never actually saw, in the years that I've been doing research, or this is my 13th year on the air, so many different stories come out of what I call the major media. I didn't have to seek them this week, that do have a common denominator. Now, I can't go through all of them with you, but I'm going to name what I consider the major stories of the week that were in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, some of the Washington Post, some of the Los Angeles Times, and share you the titles of these names that you'll be familiar with, and cover as much as the news stories as I can, the pertinent points that were brought out this past week. There were articles about the Nugan Hand Bank in Australia. The Wall Street Journal had 3 articles last August. They updated it with 2 more important articles, and this is the bank that has to do with CIA, heroin, cocaine, and so forth. There were stories on Klaus Barbie. If I don't have time for the details tonight, the apology to France, but the meaning of that 216-page report on Klaus Barbie. Updating John DeLorean and going into Licio Gelli, the banker for Italy, for the fascists all over the world who walked out of the jail in Switzerland. Marc Rich to update, half owner of 20th Century Fox, which is all of Pebble Beach here and part of Pacific Grove and Monterey. The Los Angeles Police Department, the blackmail investigation, the computers that linked to Larry McDonald and Western Goals, Henry Kissinger and various scandals around Kissinger and not only his role in Central America, but Kissinger, period, and David Graiver, Graiver, who I've mentioned several times on this broadcast. Now, the common denominator, I did a chart that I've been charting out these programs. The common denominator between those news stories that I mentioned are missing money, narcotics, Mafia, and the international syndicate, the CIA, the Army, the military Pentagon, offshore banking, the Panama, Bahamas, the Netherlands Antilles, Switzerland, and Liechtenstein, Reinhard Gehlen and the Nazi connections, and the murders of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King. All of these people, or the people they work with, or the people they're on the board with, or their attorneys, touch bases with those particular items. The Nugan Hand alone was missing $50 million to $1 billion when it collapsed, set up by the CIA. Klaus Barbie, I said several weeks ago, is allegedly holding $17.5 million in a Zurich bank from cocaine and heroin delivered by DeLorean by way of Joseph Mengele's attorney. DeLorean still can't come up with the 17.4 missing millions. Licio Gelli walked out of the Swiss jail. He'd gone in to check out $150 million put in his bank account last September by Roberta Calvi. Marc Rich is holding on to the secret of his $20 million tax evasion scam with the Swiss government and the United States fighting over it. Why is he holding on? Because it involves Henry Kissinger and Gerald Ford. Kissinger is involved with the Monte Carlo Lodge, Licio Gelli, and going back to on the board of 20th Century Fox that Rich owns half of. And I'm going to do some details on Graiver. He was killed or walked away or was never on a plane that had $17 million that crashed in Mexico August the 7th, 1976. He absconded with $40 million, but there was $17 million on his plane. And that is one example of the missing money that these people are involved with, and the courts are chasing them all over the globe, but they're all related to each other, so it makes an interesting story. Now, I may wind up with Klaus Barbie if I have time tonight, but just one interesting story I want to share before we go to some of the other stories, or 2 of them. One was from the San Francisco Chronicle, August 19th, 1983. how the Barbie expose began. And this was from Newsday. And the gist of it is that a woman was watching television in New York in 1966, and she was concerned because two brothers, their last name was Newton, Newton, they were in the British Secret Service, and they were tortured by the Gestapo and put into camps, and they were telling about their torture. They were left crippled by the torture. And she heard on television in 1966 that the man who tortured them was on the payroll of the federal government. And she wrote to Senator Javits in New York City. She lived in New York. And she was very concerned about this and said, is this true? Now, her name just surfaced last week when the 216-page report came out, going out back to 1966. Now, this is the only political letter she ever wrote in her life. And she thought that the Senator Javits would do nothing. She said it was apparent, but nobody wanted to do anything and nothing would be done. And the reason I bring this out is people say, what good is it for what you're doing? Or if they write letters, what good is it? If we write, I can't tell you what good it is. I never met this woman, Sandra Sharkey, but her name was Zunic at the time, Z-U-N-I-C. She was married to Rudy Zunic at the time. She believed that she didn't like torture. She said she was an abused child. She didn't like it, and she wrote to Javits. Now, here's the interesting thing. One woman doesn't like torture. She doesn't think it's fair. She doesn't want her government to do that. It isn't political, left or right. So she writes to her senator. He contacts the State Department, and the State Department forwards the letter to Army Intelligence on July 19th, 1966. And he followed that up, just as Congressman Leon Panetta has followed up requests that I've had on Fritz Kramer. Now, he writes to the state, and they give it the Army. And the Army has a decision, this is written in the report this week, that they will lie to Senator Javits, and they will not tell him the man turned out to be Klaus Barbie. The letter was in the Barbie file. So the congressman gets a letter, a lie, that says that they heard about this criminal, but it was inconclusive, and they didn't tell him that he was located in Bolivia, that he had been relocated. They told them that it was a rumor that he was a war criminal and dropped it at that. So if you write and you believe that this country hasn't been taken over by the military-industrial complex, by Fritz Kramer and Henry Kissinger and Rudolph Winnecker at the Dallas coup, that's where it took place 20 years ago. The Army lies to the senator. So the senator is really a political eunuch. The Army is not accountable to him. Their taxes are paid by you, and they tell him a lie. Now, what happened? Her husband died 6.5 years ago. I will see if I can locate her. She lives in Babylon, New York, and her name is Sandra Sharkey. And I will try and locate her to see what her husband died of 6.5 years ago. Car crash, cancer, because Senator Javits, the recipient of the letter, who triggered this thing off by investigating it, is dying of the Lou Gehrig's disease, or the same kind of disease I referred to several weeks ago, when somebody close to our family got an inoculation of swine flu and got what was supposed to be Guillain-Barré that went into Lou Gehrig's disease. Okay, I think that these diseases, many of them are weapons. Isn't it interesting, the two people that triggered this whole story, one's dead and one is dying, and he's in Los Angeles being experimented on by the hospitals there as a guinea pig. Two victims, coincidence? I doubt it. If you saw my files and you added it up, you wouldn't believe that either. Another story, how Klaus Barbie was almost used as a British spy. The British wanted him, and they interviewed him, and they used a Nazi, Dr. Emil Hoffman, Hoffman. I got this from the London Times, August 14th, 1983. And the Americans interrogated and used Klaus Barbie in such a way that he wouldn't want to go to the British. He was more useful to us. So when the Americans had him, they were more persuasive instead of going to the British. But don't think the British are clinging on this any more than the United States government. The British banks, the American banks, funded Adolf Hitler. They had Walter Dornberger, Nazi war criminal in London. The Nuremberg people said he belonged on the dust heap of humanity. Dornberger and Werner von Braun, who ran Dora concentration camp with slave labor until they were bones, and piled until more people were brought in and more bones. The British released him, and he became an executive of Bell Helicopter out in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And Michael Payne, an inventor and worker with Walter Dornberger, was the host of Lee and Marina Oswald in Fort Worth and Dallas, rather. That's how I happened to catch on to the Nazi connection going back to 1964 and realizing how big it was. So the British had a Nazi working with them, and Dr. Emil Hoffman, but he didn't recruit Barbie. Barbie came to the work of the United States. Isn't that lovely? So the Army can lie to the congressman, and when he asks a question, he doesn't get the answer. Now, I don't quote New Solidarity very often because Lyndon LaRouche and that gang are so flaky. They come out with a lot of crazy material that's contradictory, and they're always looking for the British or the KGB in their research. But the one thing that they do have together in Executive Intelligence Review or New Solidarity or biographies of people where they were at certain cities at certain times and who they worked with. So that if you take their chronologies and what they have to say, some of it is very important. Their conclusions may be wrong. You may have numbers 2, 4, 6, and 8 and add them up. The conclusions may be wrong, but the numbers are the same. If somebody comes along, they can add them up better. And in New Solidarity, July 25th, 1983, they had an article, what did they say about the Kremlin's Kissinger sex file, or did Henry blackmail his way back? And it has to do with Henry Kissinger and the use of blackmail in the sex tapes of recently murdered Vicki Morgan to get into the Reagan camp again and the Reagan kitchen cabinet. Now, I helped them. They called me on that story. I don't write for them. And they asked me what I thought about Vicki Morgan's murder and Henry Kissinger 2 weeks later being put on this committee for Central America. And I said the day that Vicki Morgan had her head cracked, I mentioned Henry Kissinger and the William Morris Agency and the role that Henry Kissinger could have. And 2 weeks later, Henry Kissinger was appointed to a position that Ronald Reagan said he would never have for him. But Kissinger had the contacts at the place where Pancoast worked and where Vicki Morgan had taken her book and where Gerald Ford is and Alexander Haig at the William Morris Agency in Beverly Hills. And Kissinger, I am positive, just as this article states and goes into the details about the smoking tapes. They talk about Fat Henry's political tunes in Washington and how he blackmails Hollywood with sexual blackmail and so forth. And all of that is true. Now, an important story about David Graiver. I mentioned him. Oh, I didn't look up. I haven't indexed my tapes. It was about a year ago. A story on the Sterling National Bank in Boston. David Graiver, Robert Vesco, Michael Sindona. And the reason I mentioned David Graiver was the links of the Vatican and to Otto von Bolschwing and the network of Nazis behind the assassinations. And then a listener, World Watchers, reminded me, and I put on the air the next week, that when James Earl Ray, who says he's a patsy in the murder of Martin Luther King, when Ray was talking about the assassination of Martin Luther King, he had the name David Graiver among his possessions, Graiver. This is a fellow from Argentina, a multimillionaire. As I say, his airplane went down. Evidently, his body was never found. Involved with from 17 to 40 million missing out of Argentina. But he was on the way to buy a bank in New York City, and then that bank collapsed. He was going to purchase the American Bank and Trust. He owned the Swiss Israel Bank of Tel Aviv, and he wanted to buy this American bank. He owned newspaper in Argentina Mr. Timmerman worked for, and he disappeared. At least his jet went down, and they believe he was dead. There was no proof. August 7th, 1976. The Houston Post has a long article about David Graiver. This is August the 15th, 1983, this past week. But the last paragraph of this article in the Houston Post is the one that caught my eye, because in talking about his multinational links to the international mafia, they have him to the international mafia, to the Swiss banks, to Argentina, the fascist that he worked for, the fascist government there, buying American banks. The last paragraph says, there's one mystery still surrounding the Graiver case is the shadowy Dr. Penaloza, Penaloza. Dr. Penaloza was a high-ranking bagman who named, it says, the Montenegro bagman named Raoul Jose Magario took payments from David. Now, he was supposed to be Raul. This mysterious Dr. Penaloza received money from David Graiver under the name of Raoul. That's about all we need for the Martin Luther King case to be broken wide open, because James Earl Ray said that Raoul bought him his gun, told him where to go. He had never been in a Lorraine motel in his life. He'd never even been in the town. And he was heavily financed. He had walked out of the penitentiary, St. Louis, Missouri, with assistance. He had gone to Los Angeles. He'd gone back east. Memphis, Tennessee. He had gone back to Los Angeles. He was in Mexico. He was in Montreal. And after he shot Martin Luther King, he left town and went back up to Canada and then to London and then to Portugal. And then he was going to London and then he was going out to Rhodesia, and he was picked up at the airport in London just about 2 days after Robert Kennedy was assassinated. He was traveling around all this time, had passports and had money, and said Raoul. Now, James Earl Ray had the name David Graiver among some of his possessions, along with a associate of General Walker among the names that he had, David Graiver. And this particular story, Houston Post, talks about Raoul took payments from David. Now, he was down, James Earl Ray was down in Mexico, and some of the $17 million could have gone to the International Mafia assassination team. This article claims that Graiver was blackmailed by the International Mafia, a wealthy Jewish family from Argentina working with the military junta. So now we have to go after the Raoul who had the money to pay James Earl Ray, who got the money from David, and James Earl Ray had the name David Graiver. I don't think you need much more to put that case together. All you have to do now is to find out where the $17 million went that were on the plane with David Graiver, or where he is now. A year ago, there was a story about him that I mentioned on the air. It was the New York Times, August 27th, 1982, about his mysterious plane crash and the money he was carrying. And New Solidarity has a full-page story that came out on the links of him to Robert Vesco and Michael Sindona, and that would fit in with Otto von Bolschwing and the Vatican, and Simon Rifkin, the attorney for the Sterling Bank, and also the attorney for Chris Kraft. John DeLorean is on the board of that. The New Solidarity was March 21st, 1983. So this new story just came out. This is August 16th, 1983, Houston Post. Very important story. Now, Nugan Hand Bank is a crucial bank. It's formed by Michael Hand and Frank Nugan. Michael Hand was murdered. Frank Nugan's on the run, they say, in South Africa. It collapsed. It had to do with the top generals of the United States, the admirals, with George Bush at Task Force 157, with John Paisley, who died. He had mysterious death, and his papers are now being reactivated by his wife. Theodore Shackley was one of the men that came from Germany that worked with Edwin Wilson and Bay of Pigs, that was involved at counterintelligence with the Kennedy assassination. There were three stories, as I said before, in the Wall Street Journal in August on the Nugan Hand Bank, August 82. And there are two this past week. The Nugan Hand aided U.S. covert acts, the bank in Australia, the CIA bank. And I'm going to do more on that next week. I want to do a few other articles in detail. But in the meantime, go to your library and copy August the 16th and August 17th. The second article is the bank's links to ex-CIA men detailed. Well, I don't think they're ex-CIA men. It talks about Admiral Inman, who has these giant computers now down in Texas, Mitchell Werbel, who I said could supply the silencers for the assassination teams out of Georgia, DeKalb, Georgia, and the Larry McDonald headquarters of syndicate organized crime. This bank and the people named in these two articles go back again to the coup in Dallas in 19 63 and the Kennedy assassination, and I will chart and outline them for you, but in the meantime, I don't want you to miss them. Now, there were several stories, two important ones on Licio Gelli. I won't talk about all of them. One was the London Times, Sunday London Times, August the 14th. It's called The Springing of Licio Gelli. They don't say he was kidnapped. It's the springing of Licio Gelli. And the main points of this article are that he's powerful, he's influential, he started business as a salesman with guns and pharmaceuticals. Then he sold NATO 40,000 mattresses and began his fortune in Argentina with Juan Perón in the 1950s. That's when the Odessa Bormann money was released when Evita Perón got her quickie cancer. Then he returned to Italy and became the head of the Secret Masons and acquired his vast archive of people through blackmail. Now, this story tells how he walked out of that very tight prison. There's no way he could have gotten out without help. And it details the kind of assistance he had and who would want him out. It says he knew everybody in the Italian government, the ministers, cabinet ministers, the bankers, the head of the Secret Service, the civil servants, the judges, the police chiefs. They had to let him out because if he had a trial in Italy for absconding with millions, billions of dollars, and a lot of other convoluted conspiracies and charges, too many people would be named. So he was assisted in leaving the jail. Then Wall Street Journal had a story, Gelli's disappearance adds to the mystery surrounding P2 and his role as chief. And finally, the Wall Street Journal says that, well, we didn't take him seriously, and the Masonic Lodge wasn't that big, but evidently it was. That he not only worked for Franco and Mussolini, but when Italy collapsed, he worked for the Nazis in Italy afterwards, and he kept all the secrets of Italy and the worldwide fascist network, and he bought the controlling interest when it was going under of Corriere della Sera, Corriere Della Sera. He had the largest newspaper in Italy. He was tied up with the largest bank, the Banco Ambrosiano. He's out wandering somewhere, but they detailed how he left and why he had to go, which seems perfectly obvious, except they try to say he was kidnapped, and that's insulting to the intelligence. Now, updating the John DeLorean story for you, there were some very important stories on that, but mainly an article in the Los Angeles Times telling about the Stephen Lee Arrington, Arrington, who was involved in being arrested with John DeLorean, and he was telling the police that he brought in 650 pounds of cocaine into the Mojave in 1982. He's not being charged with that, and he's brought in over $190 million of street value and another 700 pounds of cocaine in Los Angeles, and he's not being charged with that. But he would help, he pleaded guilty, he would help with the DeLorean case if they wanted. But also part of that article and part of the Houston Post is something that I have been talking about since Joseph Ball became the attorney for John DeLorean as soon as he was arrested. The attorneys for John DeLorean have asked U.S. District Judge Robert Takasugi, Takasugi, for 51, the judge has asked for 51 documents to be handed to him for inspection by the court before the case begins. Now, this is the judge that ordered the case to be in the tightest secrecy, and it took a court order and a questionable lawsuit to get into the hearings when the DeLorean case opens. And the reason I think the judges' names are important is once in a while they get bumped off or killed or become chief justices if they keep a secret long enough. So I think you should remember these names. Now, this judge has asked for 51 documents from U.S. Army Intelligence, the National Security Council, the Internal Revenue, the U.S. Customs, several departments of the Justice, the State Department, field offices of the FBI, the Defense Intelligence Agency of the Pentagon. That was Mr. Graham, who is part of Western Goals with Larry McDonald from Murder Incorporated, with computers in and out of the Los Angeles Police Department. Now, that's a nice shopping list, isn't it, for a man who just happened to be caught with $24 million worth of narcotics to save his auto company. I said right from the beginning that this had to be a very big story, and I suspected that he was part of the Odessa network, working with Cardinal Cook out of St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City. And John DeLorean is so big that when all this comes, they'll either have to let him off or they'll give him a slap on the hand, the wrist, and let the whole thing fade away like all these other cases. I don't know what they'll do when they try to get these papers because they'll show his links with the federal government. There was another story in the newspaper about Lotus cards. He worked with Colin Chapman. Chapman was a car designer until he died. I believe he was murdered. As soon as DeLorean was arrested, Chapman died quickly, and he manufactured Lotus cars. And as soon as he was dead, the cars split. The company was going bankrupt anyway, and I got an article from the London Times that to rescue Lotus car, Toyota has come in. Japan has moved in to take the company. Now, are these people being moved out? The Americans and the British and the Japanese and German are taking the car companies. As soon as DeLorean was arrested and Chapman was dead, then Toyota moves in to supply the money to rescue this car company, the Lotus. And there was another story about the debts of this car company and how furious one of the members of the board was that he wasn't told about the intended takeover of his car company. And he was furious. It was very secretive and hush-hush, which is consistent with a lot of things going on, transferring the ownership of companies that were once American or British to Germany and Japan. There was a dead meeting, according to the New York Times, on DeLorean Motors this last week. They're still looking for that $17.5 million. Now, I mentioned on broadcast 607 that I called the FBI in Detroit and told them the information I had. The FBI man was Dick Ogleston, Oeggleston, in Detroit, Michigan. And I sent him a packet of information on John DeLorean, the Bank of America, his holdings, and the allegations of his buying his cocaine from Klaus Barbie before they were both arrested, of course, and the possibility of Fritz Steinecker, that's the name I had, Steinacker, out of Austria, the attorney for Joseph Mengele, is going to a Zurich bank and depositing for DeLorean. Now, the two men that gave me this information who've traveled to South America over and over again and are very interested in these cases, I gave them their phone number, their name. The FBI didn't call either one of them this week, never contacted them, didn't follow up on this at all, and I sent them packets of material. And furthermore, one of the men was at a motor place. It was a show of farm delivery or equipment, and he was eating some cheesecake in a restaurant where they went to a party, and he'd had a reservation. I asked if they had walked in. By chance, it was a dinner where he had a reservation, and he got very, very sick from the cheesecake. Not violently, but it was noticeably sick, really sick from eating this cheesecake, which does happen, and in summer weather things go bad. But he got a phone call last week, did you like the cheesecake? How did it go down? And then 2 days later, he got another telephone call, do your children eat cheesecake? This was from a different person. It calls from back east. He lives in the Midwest. So what he got instead of a call to inquire by the FBI on his belief that John DeLorean was with Klaus Barbie with cocaine down in Bolivia, what he got was a sick stomach and threats. And you may ask the question, does it do any good to call the FBI? Well, I think just as this other woman did with the story that turned out to be Klaus Barbie, you have to take chances. And eventually, we are going to find somebody who follows these things through, and it really does matter. Now, Marc Rich is one of my favorite characters. I talk about him a lot on the air, and I want to give you a chronology of Marc Rich to update you because, as I say, he not only owns a big hunk of the property up here, but he's an international man who quickly made $50 million within 2 years. That's pretty good. And he made it when the oil prices went up with the help of Henry Kissinger. Then he secretly bought 50% of 20th Century Fox that Marvin Davis obviously wasn't going to own totally, and he comes in with the money. Now, chronologically, I've done a couple of the articles on Marc Rich, but I want to take you chronologically where he is now because it's a scandalous story on deception or lying to the federal government and the collusion of the Swiss government in prohibiting the Americans from knowing where the flight capital is going, which is almost similar, not equal, but similar to the State Department and Army, lying to a senator who asked a fairly decent question. The Marc Rich story really began in August the 8th. A year and a half ago, the federal government wanted the records of his bookkeeping because he has two companies, and he sold one part of oil to the other company at a depressed price and wrote it off so that he could have a $20 million profit that then went to a Swiss bank that belonged in the American tax till. So the New York Times, August the 8th, had the story behind the Marc Rich agreement that he will cooperate with the federal government on these charges. I see it is just half past the hour of 8. Maybe I should just take a 1-minute break with you and go back to Marc Rich and some more stories, and also Klaus Barbie, because it's a good time to take a break. Also contribute in a lot of ways to the station. There's rummage sales and different charities and concerts and things. And if you like this kind of broadcasting, contribute. And if you don't like it, turn it off. That's what I told somebody who complained about it. He has 24 hours a day. Just turn it off for 1 hour, and he has his freedom and we have ours. So give the station what you can. They appreciate it, and it's badly needed. And maybe we can fix the stereo monitor and take some calls, okay? Now release the pause. I'm going to get this one of these days. I do pretty good. I'll say again, this is August 22nd, 1983, side 2 of, if you tape record it or broadcast, it's Mae Brussell, KAZU FM in Pacific Grove, California. Now, Marc Rich, as I said a minute ago, is symbolic of the kind of shenanigans of huge money, mystery money, unnamed places, unnamed sources, secret papers. He agreed after a year and a half that he would turn over his papers and cooperate with the government. And on August the 9th, a day later, he paid a fine because he was withholding the government to the judge of $1.25 million. He has a lot of money, so I'm sure it doesn't hurt him, but it's beginning to hurt him with customers right now, that he would turn over papers important to the courts to see if he had taken $20 million or more tax money out of this country and put somewhere in another bank. He did agree to turn over the papers, and 2 days later, after he told the judge he would, and it was in all the newspapers, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, they're following it closely now. 2 days after that, I mentioned last week, he was seized at the airport with a woman was flying to Zug, Switzerland. I don't even know where Zug, Z-U-G, is, in Switzerland, with 2 trunks of papers that the federal government had been wanting for a year and a half, and that he promised 2 days before. This is a man of his honor. I mean, these are real sleazy operators, all of them, whether it's David Graiver or Marc Rich or these Mr. Charles Bluedorn or Richard Nixon, these big operators making piles of money, these multinationals. Henry Kissinger's working for them, making their profits, and then being put on the board of their corporations. He promised 2 days later he would turn over the money, okay? Now, he wanted to sell all of a sudden. He's caught at the airport. He's caught with the goods, his fingers in the cookie jar. And the next article is in the L.A. Times, August the 12th, 1983. Rich stymied by the court in the pursuit of Fox sale. It's hurting Fox Studio. The judge threatens to tie up all of his American money. He wants to sell 50% of Fox Studio. It's hard to do that on a few hours' notice. And he's going to do that. His papers have been seized, and in the United States, the ones that he was taking out of the country. Now, after he puts up a offer to sell Fox Studio, August 15th, the paper from the Wall Street Journal, Switzerland enters the Marc Rich case and seizes important documents. Now, over in Switzerland, he has papers. He's from Belgium and big holdings in the Netherlands Antilles. The Swiss government goes into his office and takes the papers that the United States government wants. I mean, isn't that really nice? Instead of saying neutral, these are our so-called allies that we wheel and deal with. And it's just a measly, like $20 million in tax dollars, but it isn't that. It's Henry Kissinger and it's Gerald Ford and it's the whole administration that raised the oil prices in the Middle East for the Shah and for these various people for Chase Manhattan. And the same Swiss government that let Licio Gelli walk out of that tight security prison last week, the government goes in and seizes the important documents. Now, the judge is probably one of the most honest judges in America, Judge Sand, federal judge. I just can't believe there's such a man, S-A-N-D. You have to remember that name, and that's pretty easy to remember. He's absolutely furious. I've never known a judge who showed any indignation with these crooks. And he threatened to close all the Marc Rich United States operations. There's 30 or more, including the Chase Manhattan, and he closed them all up. He's furious at what happened. And he said the Swiss government came in and took the golden nuggets. Now, that's a new expression. I'm so tired of hearing the tip of the iceberg is showing. He said they took the golden nuggets that we've wanted a year and a half, and besides flying papers out, what was over there they took. Then there's another Washington Post story. Marc Rich agrees to turn over the documents already. And this story has to do with how he made his oil profit. This was dated August the 9th, about how he made his $50 million. It doesn't tell you how he made it, but from 1974 to 1976, he made $50 million. Now, 1974 is when Michael Sindona lost $45 million and more from his Italian banks. And I'm wondering if there was a transfer from a bank in New York City that belongs to Americans that went bankrupt that makes Mr. Marc Rich have a corporation over in Switzerland and in the United States and the Netherlands Antilles. These missing millions, one is missing 17 million here and another has 17 million there. And these figures seem to overlay or sound similar if you can go by the figures. So when Michael Sindona is missing his, and the bank goes under those 45 million, all of a sudden this guy shows up with 50 million in 2 years. That would be impossible unless it's illegal or narcotics or some kind of a ripoff if the oil prices were engineered by H. Kissinger and Chase Manhattan. And he has his money tied up among other banks, Chase Manhattan. The New York Times, August 18th, has Marc Rich's International Business Network. I suggest you get that paper if you're interested in this subject because there's two articles in the section of the New York Times, two different ones, August the 18th. One is called Marc Rich, Empire Builder, Success Story Amid Secrecy, about his brilliance for business coups. Well, Henry Kissinger is the National Security Council and Secretary of State, and on the board of 20th Century Fox is William Rogers from the entire narcotic, the Bahamas and the offshore, the Resorts International, and Henry Kissinger, knowing where all the bodies are buried and the narcotics are coming in, and the oil profits are, what do you need besides the CIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and the National Security Council as your best friends? And the President of the United States, Jerry Ford, who he puts on the board of his company of 20th Century Fox, those three guys know everything. And Anna Chenault is on the board, and Grace Kelly. They knew everything, Mr. Rogers and Ford and Kissinger. So how did he make his money? Obviously, and then he rewards the buddies and puts them on the board. Now, there's also a very good chart in the New York Times of the holdings of Marc Rich. And this is important. It tells about his Swiss concerns. One in Zug, Switzerland, called Marc Rich and Company AG, with 5 subsidiaries, 2 in Switzerland, Marc Rich and Company and Seymour Trading, and 3 in Panama. Again, the Panama banks, the Vatican, Paul Marcinkus, Jonestown, Michael Sindona, the whole gang. There's many banks in Panama, but he has the Hyams Consultant, the Rescor Incorporated, RESCOR, and the Liquine Resources, LIQUEIN, 5 subsidiaries of Marc Rich and Company. In the United States, he has Marc Rich and Company, formed in 1974, the year when the big bucks, he starts going to business, but closed. He changed the name when the judge wanted the papers. As I mentioned last week, he changed the name of the corporation. He's got Marc Rich and Company Export that's suspended in 1980, and Guam Oil and Refining Company. Then in the Netherlands Antilles, he has Richco, NV Incorporated, formed in 1980 with 9 subsidiaries, 1 in Great Britain, 3 in Switzerland, 3 in the United States, and 2 major ones in the Netherlands Antilles. I charted those countries out and how they interconnect, and that's in the New York Times if it interests you. The Wall Street Journal and the New York Times are filled with this, and because he's so close to Henry Kissinger and Gerald Ford and John DeLorean, who on the board of Chris Kraft bought 20%, again, I repeat, of 20th Century Fox, a part of that pie, these guys' names aren't going to go away for a long time. Now, getting back a little bit now on Klaus Barbie, we have some more time. I would like to do an hour on Barbie, but I'll do some of that this evening. There was, in addition to the story of Senator Javits and how that broke, there was an article, again, I mentioned New Solidarity, because August the 8th, 1983, on the lawyer representing Klaus Barbie. And he has such an interesting biography. I'd love to take these people and see where they were at certain times and certain years. And that's the one thing this organization has, that the L.A. Times, the Associated Press, United Press, none of them have chronologies until somebody dies. Then they have the obituary in every movie they made and every song they wrote. But they wait till they die to tell every corporation they were on, every board. But the New Solidarity, to give credit, does have information that the years are consistent. And there was a story about the attorney for Klaus Barbie who wants him out of jail. They say his life is threatened in jail, and they want him out on the streets. This is San Francisco Examiner, Wednesday, August 17th. His attorney is Jacques Verges, Verges. He says his client might be murdered in jail for fear he would reveal the collaboration of French officials with the Nazis during World War II. He wants him out, and the judge says no. The Lyon judge says, no, I don't take your petition. Mr. Verg, your client stays in. And New Solidarity did a story on the lawyer for Gestapo chief Klaus Barbie. A little background on Jacques Verg. He's sort of like the Melvin Belli or Percy Foreman or Leon Jaworski of the French government, I suppose. Here's the biography of just the missing years, of course. Jacques Verg was born in Thailand. His mother is Vietnamese. His father is French. They moved to the French island of La Réunion in the Indian Ocean. He was born there in 1924. The years pass. In 1941, he is working as an anti-colonialist in Paris. He's fighting the French and their colonies. He's 17 years old in 1941, and he's a student with Pol Pot, the famous, horrible person from Cambodia, the torturer, the dictator. He's the associate of Pol Pot as a young student in Paris in 1941. Then there's some missing years that aren't listed here, and he goes from Paris to Prague, Czechoslovakia, where he works with the International Student Union, part of the Soviet Union, which reminds me of Lee Harvey Oswald's trip to Minsk, Russia, where he picks up Marina Oswald from Minsk, Russia. And he works with the International Student Relief Fund, and he also is given assistance by them. He's part of that from 1950 to 51. He's there. The student with Pol Pot is lapsed. They don't have that information. He returns to Paris, where he no longer is a communist any more than Lee Harvey Oswald was when he returned from the Soviet Union, and was meeting with George de Mohrenschildt, wanted as a Nazi war criminal, a man with ties to the Defense Department, the CIA, the FBI, and so forth. All of a sudden, this Mr. Jacques Verge is no longer a communist, you might guess. 1954, and he goes to law school in Paris. He resumes law school 1954 to 1956. He's in law school and lives in Paris in 1956, and then he begins defending the FLN, that's the Algerian National Liberation Front, that wanted their freedom against France. He's over there, and he represents Chieftain Ahmed, A-H-M-E-D, Ben Bella. Any of you that know the story of Algeria know about Ben Bella, who took over and made Algeria a country, took it away from the French, and then when Jacques Verg leaves that country, his friend is kicked out. He's no longer in. Now, during this time, he's close to Francois Genoud, G-E-N-O-U-D, the head of the Nazi International, who was Bella's protector, and he was living over there. July 5th, 1962, this is 1 year before the Kennedy assassination, Algeria declares its independence. Jacques Verg leaves Algeria and goes to Damascus and takes on an Islamic name. He becomes Jacques Mansour, M-A-N-S-O-U-R, and he marries somebody from the FLN, a bomb squad person, and he's involved with operations in Angola. And Ben Bella has now landed in Algeria with a mysterious plane crash in 1963 and is removed from the government. The government is taken over by a military dictatorship, in 1964, and Ben Bella is in isolation for 14 years. So he was his friend and buddy. He was with Pol Pot and continues then to live with Pol Pot, who's exiled, who's part of the Cambodian massacre. And whether he betrayed Ben Bella and turned him over to the future military dictatorship, we don't know, but he has a sleazy background in espionage and counter-espionage. Then Jacques Vergs, VERGS, goes to Israel. That's figures. He defends a Jordanian terrorist by the name of Hedzi. I can't pronounce it. Let's spell it. Hedjazi. Okay, Jordanian terrorist. And then he also defends Moshe Samshambe, whose plane was forced out of Algeria. And he goes to the Arab bloc, and he goes back to Israel in 1969 and works for members of George Habash's Popular Front, the Liberation of Palestine. Now that gets interesting. The lawyer for Klaus Barbie working for George Habash's members, because I mentioned many times, if you don't have the broadcast that I've done on Robert Byron Watson, you can get those. The links from Georgia to George Habash in Lebanon and with the PLO, and his brother in Chile, part of Murder Incorporated, that dies in, again, right up to Western Goals in the Los Angeles Police Department today. He went working as a defense lawyer for 3 members of George Habash's Popular Front. And I've made the allegations that I believe Mark David Chapman, when he went to Lebanon, worked with Habash because the people from DeKalb County, where he came from, are directly funded by drugs, weapons, and syndicate and narcotics traffic. So if a person defending Klaus Barbie is working in 1969 with Habash, by 1970, Ronald Reagan he's the governor of California. Richard Nixon is president, and that's when Klaus Barbie becomes part and parcel of the cocaine king and the trafficking down in Bolivia and South America. Cocaine, heroin, hashish is open sesame when Nixon is finally in. It's the Nazis and the Mafia. And by 1969, the Jacques Verg is working for Habash, and he may have made the introductions to the Klaus Barbie down there, because I've mentioned before that during this time period, the French connections were cut off, the processing in Marseille, and there were arrests and scandals about the drug connections. So instead of processing, they shipped it down to Colombia and Bolivia, and this was the territory of the death squads and the terrorists that I mentioned before. Now, he was in Israel for 3 months defending these various terrorists up till 1970, and in 1972 he was seen in Paris for a short while, and then there was no trace of him from 1972 to 1978. And according to this story, there were allegations that he was living with Cambodia's dictator Pol Pot. When he was kicked out of Cambodia, this notorious person, then Jacques Verg was with him. Well, you know the cocaine and heroin connections of the drug connections of Cambodia and these people. So it would be logical that the attorney for Klaus Barbie that steps in at this point has touched all these bases, besides the Vietnamese mother and the background of Southeast Asia and Pol Pot and George Habash in the Middle East. Ben Bella was released in 1979 as a non-person from the prison. He's lucky he wasn't murdered. Most of these people are murdered. His government was just overthrown. And in 1979, Verg, V-E-R-G-S, goes back to Paris to study law again, and he registers with the Paris Bar Association, and his first client's last name was Tsutsumi, T-S-U-T-S-U-M-I, a rich Japanese heiress with French casinos, and his second client was Klaus Croissant, like the piece of pastry, C-R-O-I-S-S-A-N-T, a lawyer for the Baader-Meinhof, again linked to George Habash and Carlos, and then he defends people who were involved with Carlos the terrorist. Carlos was with Frank Turple and Edwin Wilson and Samuel Cummings up in London. You know, Mr. Cummings, who armed Turple and Wilson and Gaddafi, the brother-in-law of Senator John Tower of the Foreign Relations Committee. Okay, he represented Bruno Brequet, B-R-E-Q-U-E-T, and Magdalena Kopp, K-O-P-P, associates of Carlos. Those are some of the clients of Jacques Verg. He did go to Israel to defend some of the terrorists, the PLO. He was evidently welcome in Israel as a lawyer and went on as an advisor. He was closely associated with Regis Debray. That's never been told the role that Debray had in the death of Che Guevara. He was supposed to be his best friend. He's close to the government in Paris, strangely enough, at the present time, and there were links of Klaus Barbie to the murder of Che Guevara. Now, this article on Jacques Verge says that he will use the trial like the Nazi Germany, the technique for the Nazi Germans, and turn the defense into an accusation. Now, that's what John DeLorean is doing. He's asking for his papers from the National Security Council, the FBI, the CIA, the State Department. Remember at Watergate when James McCord had Bernard Fensterwall as his attorney and threatened to bring the whole house down with blackmail if they got too involved? And Howard Hunt made threats, and William Colby made threats to Howard Baker. I have copies of those threats. So he was linked to George Habash in Beirut, Lebanon, directly linked to Representative Larry McDonald, partner of Roy Cohn and Admiral Moore and Edward Teller. It's not only a drug connection, it's a military connection, it's atomic bomb connections, it's Nazis. And this article on the attorney and the bases he touches is familiar with many of the broadcasts that you've heard me talk about. Now, about the report that came out last week on Klaus Barbie. In March, our President Ronald Reagan ordered William French Smith, we have to find out about the allegations that Klaus Barbie worked for the United States. And I was really surprised at Mr. Ryan. I shouldn't have been surprised. Anyone such as Alan Ryan Jr., who took how many years, since 1945, to let Nazis like Mr. Arturkovich and Mr. Tripia or maybe Walter Dornberger or all the other Nazi war criminals in this country, to let them be here, you must know what part he's playing. But I'm always a little bit shocked. I'm not shock-proof yet. So when he comes out with a presentation of his report, it was identical to Earl Warren, the Chief Justice of the United States, holding up the Warren report and saying this is the definitive study. There's all kinds of horrors. These are political horrors. They'll do anything for a price and a job. Maybe they believe what they're doing, but they're liars. And they have to have some oath, just like the House Select Committee. They never went into Raoul or Graiver. They don't care at all. They'll spend $6 million, publish a book. They even said at the end of the conclusion of Martin Luther King there was a conspiracy. But Jesse Jackson's running around not wanting to be president. He hasn't asked who, and he was on the balcony. And so was Andrew Young. So you can't expect much from anybody. I don't care, black, white, left, center, or red. You do your individual responsibility. And Mr. Ryan is a disgrace for the human race, but he's got a lot of company, so it's okay. Now, he came out with a report, and various sources you have. I'll quote from them from the Monterey Herald, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and so forth, as much as we have time on his report. And first of all, some quotes I'll give directly from his report, and then I will rebut them, and I'd like to meet him face to face. The report places the blame on Army officers who hired him as a spy. I don't believe that 6 Army officers hired Klaus Barbie because he happened to know what was going on in certain little towns. He was in Lyon all the time, so he wouldn't know much about the Russians or in Germany where he was located. I believe, and I've said before, and it can be documented over and over again, that by 1943 to 1947, Alan Dulles in Bern, Switzerland, with Hitler's agents and Himmler's agents and SS Karl Wolff in the Vatican, and the top Nazis worked with the international bankers and made a decision that they would use these Nazis when the war was over. Those were 6 hired guys, and most of them are dead, and the 2 survivors said they didn't remember the incident. There's a cartoon in the paper of an army man interviewing a fellow whose shirt says Klaus Barbie and his hands are dripping of blood. And he says, the Butcher of Lyon, that's a strange name. He's telling him who he is, and the guy doesn't think that's an unusual name. Now, the report says, and quote, President Reagan was satisfied that the Justice Department had done a thorough job in researching all available information and reaching its conclusion that there was no interagency conspiracy to conceal Barbie from the French. lie number 2. Oh, half of this is true. Ronald Reagan was satisfied. That part is true. But the part that they did, there was no interagency, there's a double part here. Okay, part 1 and 2. The fact that to the interagency, it was the OSS, it was the CIC, the Counterintelligence Corps, it was the State Department, it was all of them. It was Navy Intelligence, Project Paperclip that brought those monsters here. It was the Air Force. It was an interagency. We used them all over the place. And to say no interagency conspiracy that 6 Army people and 4 are dead, I mean, it's absolute insults your intelligence. Third point, quote, Barbie was recruited to report on French intelligence operations in the United States zone of Germany, on activities of Romanian ethnic Germans, and on Soviet, anti-Soviet activities in the U.S. zone. I don't believe that's what he was doing at all. He was at Oberammergau. He was with Henry Kissinger. He was with Fritz Kramer. I believe they kept him from 1945. Well, they had him from 1947 officially. He was wandering around in amnesia until then. They didn't even have him. They haven't told where he was in 1946, but the French wanted him. He was with the top Nazis that went in, General Patton and General Clay and the whole gang, and William Casey was involved, and Prince Bernhard and the whole hogwash that were at the Battle of the Bulge. They went in there. They went to Hitler's headquarters and his home. They used his staff that I've mentioned on the air, and they decided he would be useful someday down in South America to do what he was doing once Richard Nixon was president, starting after the killing of John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy and Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and Adlai Stevenson and the whole gang. The world is theirs, Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan and those Nazis. They don't need any vote from Congress or any letters from your congressman. Barbie was trained with them, and he was with them up to the last moment when he was shipped off. He was in the United States with these people. Why would Thomas Dewey, the prosecutor of New York City, who came to fame catching Murder Incorporated, catching Luciano, why would he release a man from Murder Incorporated and send him to Italy to work with the United States Army? Doesn't that tell you that they want the dope running, that the gun running, that criminals are in, and the crippled people like those guys that this woman saw on television are out? Of course. Next sentence from the report. After using the Gestapo officer Klaus Barbie for their informant for nearly 4 years in post-war Europe, the U.S. intelligence officials engineered an elaborate obstruction of justice and slipped him out of France, which is now called the Rat Line. That is true that they engineered an elaborate obstruction of justice, but don't think it was made for him. It was made for thousands of them. And the gold and the art from Europe and the banks were emptied. And the Bormann money, Martin Bormann's money, and a lot of it put in the safe accounts of Evita Peron, it was salted away. So by the 1950s, when Evita died, the banks were opened up. In 1950, all of a sudden, these multinationals are making all their money. Okay? So there was absolutely no reason to believe the Rat Line was just for him. And they pride themselves that they did this elaborate thing and sneaked him down because they, at this point, couldn't tell the French where he was. Next sentence. The investigation was ordered in March. I said this part before, after widespread reports that Barbie was protected by the U.S. intelligence. It was ordered in March. It was finished in August. Next sentence. The report showed the intelligence officials lied to the office of John McCloy. Here's the big lie. Post-war High Commissioner for Germany, after the French wanted to know about Barbie, and they said they didn't know where he was while he was kept at Army Intelligence Safe House. If you want to know a little more about John Warren Commission McCloy, with Alan Dulles on the Warren Commission, get broadcasts that I did 585 and 584, just a background of John McCloy, with Rudolf Hess, with Adolf Hitler, with I.G. Farben, the law office that represented Farben, with his making the decision when the Bulge invasion would take place, his working with top Germans in France, and then France collapsed, retrading with the enemy, the Chase Manhattan Bank, the international banks, the role of McCloy. He's the one who rounded up the Japanese for the concentration camps. He was chairman of Ford Foundation, on the board with Henry Ford, who was a major supplier of Adolf Hitler. Imagine how they got around this thing. You saw John McCloy on television, and he had lied to the French himself when he was at the airport. They interviewed him about where Klaus Barbie was, and Ryan comes along and says the Army lied to McCloy that he was innocent. If ever there was a guy that had swastikas on 2 arms and legs, it's John McCloy. Well, our time is up. We only have about 15 seconds, and now it's going to 10. We'll do more on Klaus Barbie because the lies are identical to the way they presented the Warren Commission. It was 20 years ago, so let's see what they tell us today, and maybe you can understand what they did then. In the meantime, this is Mae Brussell. You do your homework, and I'll be back with you next week. It's KAZU-FM in Pacific Grove, California.
The views expressed by Mae Brussell during World Watchers are those of the commentator and do not reflect the opinions of KAZU, its board of directors, or staff.